New York City's data journey was, it really started well before Mayor Bloomberg got in there. There was this thing called the Mayor's Management Report that was initiated under Mayor Koch, who had been literally like 15 years before Bloomberg got into office. And it was a performance management program, right? Like, how much trash did we pick up this week? All that, how many crimes were there? How many fires? It was all a quantification of what had been going on in the city on a quarterly basis, and they put out this big, PDF or even this paper, and nobody really looked at it, but it was primarily to show to the taxpayers, this is how your money's getting spent, right? And it was like a primitive first effort at it. By the time Bloomberg got into office, not to skip over Mayor Giuliani, who had a huge impact on crime, but by the time Bloomberg got into office, Mayor Bloomberg made all his money in Bloomberg LP by injecting transparency into the bond market, by making the data involved in the bond market liquid. And in so doing, he made it infinitely more effective and accessible to traders who had to use that information to make decisions. So all we did was just take that approach and apply it to city government. It was fairly straightforward. And you'll notice from what I'm saying about all this, I haven't yet once mentioned technology. Technology is a piece of this, but it was really an organizational hack. And I stood on the shoulders of 8 years of Mike Bloomberg's government before I even got started in New York. I came in term 3. So year 9 is when I got started. And they had 8 years of Mike Bloomberg running around, really beefing up the Mayor's Management Report, really making performance management a big part of what the agencies do, but also very critically launching the city's open data effort, right? And they had done a magnificent job with just kind of starting that process, going to each agency and saying, just publish what you got, right? Because the mayor wants it. All that had happened before I ever showed up, right? My career up until that point was, I started my career as a homicide prosecutor in Manhattan, and then spent some time in a big law firm, and then was in Iraq for 2 years with the Department of Justice, and then was on the Hill doing financial crime enforcement. I have a better outfit. But so I came at this as somebody who looked at all these as information problems, and I had been granted a wonderful landscape to play with by the time I got started. So I really don't deserve. The only credit I deserve is just taking the ball that they had set up for me and running with it a little bit further. Right. All that is just preface for what was it, right? We basically decided that data is an enterprise asset in the city. It's a governing asset. It's something that we could use just like we have trucks and firemen and police officers and sanitation facilities and water facilities and all the stuff that New York City is supposed to do, which is sort of laid out in these buckets, and this is far from inclusive. There's data generated in each of these, right? And that should be an enterprise asset. Prior to when we got started, it had been locked in these ancient IT systems that were in each of these agencies. And I'm not mocking those systems, because the reality is, why should we ask the taxpayer to pay for new IT systems when these were actually doing their job of enabling the agency to deliver its widget? The problem was, it just hadn't been liquefied and transferred. So you've got, for example, NYPD, which has been very data-driven for a very long time, and they're very effective at leveraging their data, right? But it's staying at PD. That information could very easily be leveraged by the fire department, by the sanitation department, by everybody. And then their information should be leverageable by the police department. So, unsurprisingly, I'm an attorney, and half the problem in New York City had nothing to do with the technology. It had to do with getting agencies to release their data to each other, right? Much less the public. So, public servants, for what it's worth, and I say this with great respect, product of a household of public servants, they're paranoid. And they get very turfy, and they don't want to share information. So it was sort of like an iron fist, velvet glove approach that we took. First, you take different data from stale systems, and you put it together and prove that it's worth the exercise of even trying to do this at the enterprise, right? Just a couple of little hacks that demonstrate that, oh, look at that, information from the Department of Finance actually speaks to fire, right? Information from the water department could help the police department, right? You just show it, just little proofs of concept, and all that was accomplished with Microsoft Excel, 3 20-year-old kids that I hired off Craigslist, for nothing, right? And very stale data, right? So, we proved very quickly, very rapidly that there was value to be had by liquefying our data, and we applied it across everything that the city does. It's just an intelligence agency. Now, intelligence agency comes across as something creepy, right? And so that's a political equity you have to deal with and a legal equity you have to deal with. But you can do that and still manage to freeze value from this information. But that's really all this is. Intelligence is about making better decisions, both strategic and tactical. And cities and political entities make hundreds of thousands of decisions every year, right? And if you can bring more information to the table for those decisions to be more effective, so that you're taking taxpayer resources and sending them where they really need to be as opposed to where you want them to be, then, because there's a delta there usually, then, now you've just gotten better at everything you do very quickly, right? But you have to prove it. You have to start somewhere, right? So we started in New York with, sorry about that. Previous. A public safety hack, right? And it was, we're the government. There was this nasty fire that in one of the outer boroughs, and a couple of kids died. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, the city had a lot of information about this place that should have told them that this was a death trap, right? So cities know a ton about what they're supposed to do, but they don't know what they know. So that's what I meant by the information being locked in all those IT systems, because the organizations themselves are all heavily siloed. So you have silos within silos, and at least the siloed solutions. However, when the press comes out with a story, first and foremost, those poor people who died really don't care that the one agency didn't talk to the other agency. They're dead, right? And it's horrible. But then more to the point, why should the press say, cut the government any slack over the fact that, well, we're structured in a way that doesn't allow us to really act on our information? They rightly beat us up for the fact that this fire occurred, right? And we could have done something about it, but didn't. So what we did was basically take a giant tax lot map of the city of New York. There's about 1 million buildings. We have 200 inspectors. We have 2,500 structural fires a year. And we got 20,000 complaints a year about conditions that lead to those structural fires. I got to send that inspector to the worst first. That's it. That's the lid. It's very straightforward. So we have the data tiles, tons of data about our locations in New York City. I had fire data that I could overlay on that and be able to kind of deconstruct the fire in New York, right, and come up with a profile for a risky building. And then I also had the ability to send those inspectors to the worst first because I had organizational backing. The mayor empowered me to do what I was supposed to do, right? That's really important. So I could beat up the agencies to get the data, and I could beat up the agencies to send their resources based on where the data said they should go, at least to test it. And then once we proved it was worth doing, then we built an enterprise capacity to scale it across the entire city, right? So again, it really was about proving why it was worthwhile to liquefy the data and then building the data infrastructure to service that, right? So we didn't spend any money until we actually needed to spend money, which I think is a mistake a lot of people make. With these smart cities initiatives, which I think are kind of bunk, they end up, what they do is they think, oh, I can buy this product and now I'm smart. It doesn't work that way. You're going to be just as dumb as you were the day after you start installing it. You see, you just have to put yourself in a position to culturally and organizationally act on intelligence as a holistic asset, right? So, you do that by proving it. There we go. So, outcomes. That's all that counts, right? I can talk all the live long day about the city. We were so political. Bloomberg did ultimately leave office after the third term, right? So everything I did in New York City was designed over the fact that I turned into a pumpkin on December 31st, 2013, and there would be a brand new game in town, right? And we were replaced fully by a new mayor, as we should be. This is a democratic process, right? So, but how do I make sure that the stuff I was doing at a political level got down and survived? That's a big issue, sustainability, right? I don't mean sustainability from a green standpoint. I mean political sustainability, right? You go through all that work, but if all you do is focus on the political actors, then it may as well be written in water, because it's just going to go away with the new mayor, right? So what I focused on was building agency capacity. So we had a hub and spoke system. My office was in the middle. It never grew larger than 9 people. I never paid any of them particularly well, but we could draw on the fact that it was New York City and the problems they were solving were way cooler than anything that Goldman Sachs would have put in front of them to do, right? That's not entirely true for every city, but in cities like London, you have the power of being London, right? Don't discount that. It's very powerful, right? And anyway, but the whole point of that exercise, we pivoted back towards the agency. So the hub and spoke was us in the middle, me kind of curating data as an enterprise asset citywide across the agencies with that remit, right? And the aggressive desire to execute that remit. And, then I would just service the agencies. The agencies were my clients, right? And usually the agencies, as soon as you start asking them, like, what are you upset about? They love bitching about each other. Like, oh, it's freaking cops. If they would just send us that data, we could get this job done. Fire department would constantly whinge about the buildings department, right? Because they wouldn't give them the data. And you go to the buildings department, it's like, well, our system sucks. What am I supposed to do with that? Give me some money, right? And so usually it was just a matter of like, no, I'm going to do an ETL once a week, and I'm going to transfer it to the fire department, and now everybody shuts up. But then you also learn very quickly, what you learn is that the fire department was right. If the buildings department does its job, there are less fires, or fewer fires, and fewer deaths. And that's what we proved here, right? So we started this little hack that was just like a VLOOKUP with like 2 kids and sending an email a week to the agency, to the buildings department for inspection. It proved very successful, as I showed, like 13% to 70%. So we built an enterprise product that did cost capital, but that submitted a signal, a risk signal, to the fire department and the buildings department so that all their inspections were geared by risk. Last June, it's coming up on our anniversary, the fire department had their first month in the city, in the history of the city, where they didn't have a death related to fire. And it's attributable directly to the inspections. So what's the outcome? I was right? But more to the point, I'm not there, right? So I don't need to be there. If you're doing your job, you're working yourself out of a job, right? You want to be in a position where you can walk away and not have the thing collapse, right? So that's what we did. Now, New York can be a bit generous, right? New York is very different in many ways. Our boroughs, meaningless, right? They're vestiges of another era, right? I mean, there's like little rivalries of kids on people naming their kids Brooklyn and whatnot, but like, and neighborhoods do count, but it's a neighborhood, it's not the borough, right? And so the boroughs are unimportant, right? And I'm sure the borough presidents would be very upset to hear me say that, but really, they do nothing, right? It's the mayor. So we have a very powerful central government in New York City, right? That enabled me to exercise great authority on his behalf to do what I needed to do to get the job done. Also, we are New York, so I could pay people dirt and have them come work for me for the thrill of working in New York City. That's not true in Poughkeepsie, right? So, the idea, you can overlearn from New York's model. I don't think that's true with London, but you can overlearn a lot from New York's model, right? So the idea now, I wear a bunch of different hats, primarily just they all revolve around using data to do stuff with. Sometimes it's for a big company, sometimes it's for the banks and the financial sector, and sometimes it's for cities. When it's for cities, I still work with former Mayor Bloomberg's foundation on this thing called What Works Cities, and it's an idea of basically taking data-driven management and applying it to cities. Right now it's restricted to the United States for cities between 100,000 and 1 million residents, right? May expand, who knows? I don't know. I'm not the one who writes the checks. But the idea is basically to take what we learned from New York, not too much, right? But the real lesson learned, like how do we get these smaller cities the ability to make better decisions, right? Through their data. How do we do that? How do we set them up to win the way we won in New York without having the New York toolkit, right? So, the first project I did, and it was just me talking to this other change agent in New York, in New Orleans named Oliver Elias. Brilliant guy, right? Who had a strong remit from his mayor and had access to the agencies and access to the data. Once he had those, that's what he needed to win, right? So we went in and we started picking projects that they could do that would forcefully proselytize the rest of the agencies and get them to realize that this is worth doing, right? And he has had tremendous success. Abatement is a thing. So there was a big hurricane in New Orleans a few years ago called Katrina. The whole city went underwater. And, they still had nuisance properties left over. A lot of people left. Properties were never torn down. Those things are a nightmare for a neighborhood on a public safety, public health, economic development standpoint, right? So the idea is to return them to market, but turn them to market in a way that respects the neighborhood, right? But also embraces the fact that the city has only so many levers it can pull, right? So we use data, right? And the same nucleus of data that allowed them to get rid of this giant this 10-year backlog, which they got rid of in 3 months, mind you, with distributed decision making. It's awesome, right? That same nucleus allows us to place smoke detectors in the most at-risk homes in the city. And a month after we instituted that program, there was some fire and some death trap, and 11 people got out because of a smoke detector that was placed by NOFD because of the data, right? I mean, that's a huge win. Now, again, those individual projects, they may not apply. I was just talking to a gentleman from the London Fire Brigade. Sounds like you guys are doing like some amazing stuff here, right? So, that's cool. The issue isn't whether, how we used or to what end we put the data. The question is we put the data to an end that serves the city in a way it had never been served, right? So why not take that intelligence, that brilliant stuff that's being done over at the London Fire Brigade, and make it useful to the boroughs, and vice versa. Let's take what the boroughs have and make it more liquid to give to LFD, the London Fire Brigade, so they can do their job, right? Same goes for City of Jackson, Mississippi. City of Jackson is a very poor city in the state of Mississippi. It's minority-majority, and they have a wonderful mayor, and they have a change agent, and they have data, and we've already gotten rolling with them on a water infrastructure project that has to speak to economic development because that's revenue, right? Leaks cause potholes, right? This thing called Yazoo clay is a nightmare. But there's also lead in the water, which ain't good. So by the same nucleus of operating intelligence, the data, right, that has been fragmented amongst a bunch of different agencies, we very ham-fistedly, crudely pull it together and start showing that there are decisions that could be optimized off of that, right? And then, Lauderdale and San Jose, it was very nice to go to Florida recently, actually, despite, the stuff. San Jose is, here's some irony. San Jose is sort of like ground zero for Silicon Valley, right? But only in the last few years that they started leveraging their own data to do their jobs, right? So there's, and, you can laugh to a certain degree, but I think, and I would join you in that, but the reality is it's not their fault. Cities act the way they act because we set them up to act this way. And so why should we be surprised when they're not leveraging information holistically? We did it to them. So if we go in empathetically, right, and say, look, what's your problem? How do I solve that? And then how do I use that solution to help this guy over here who's bitching about you, and then turn that into an enterprise product, right? That's the job. That's the lift. You pull that off, then you can make this work, and that's true for everybody, regardless of size or scale or location. So here's what I think, right? This is just my view, but I think this is repeatable when you scope the product the right way. What you need to ask when you're talking about analytics specifically is like, is there an analytic solution to this problem? And I say that only because sometimes it actually does mean the problem requires more people, right? You just have to be, embracing of reality enough to know when data isn't the light night. It's not always a solution. Data sets itself up, or data is set up to fail often because people see it as like a panacea, because it's not, right? These are for human beings to make decisions. That's it. And human beings and all their flaws and all their virtues, right? So the first thing you should be asking yourself on any problem you're trying to solve is, does analytics bring anything to the table? Or is it something else? And sometimes you get deep into it and then you realize analytics doesn't bring anything to the table, and be grown up enough to walk away and go to something else, right? Minimum viable information product. All I mean is, what's the least amount of insight that I could give to somebody to act on now, right? There are different kinds of projects. And looking at things this way, by the way, really allows you to triage. What data do I need? What resources are going to be moved? Whose cooperation do I have to procure? Things like that. The least amount of work that you can do to generate some insight to help, right? And then finally, what's the action taken? So an example is, in New York, it was simply telling inspectors, go here instead of here. We're already sending people out, so it's just turn this way instead of that way, right? Nice, easy decision downstream or upstream from the labor, right? In New Orleans, they did this really cool project, or they're doing this really cool project about ambulance placement, right? And the issue is, where do I pre-deploy my ambulance resources to send out to the city? And, most of the time in New Orleans, it was based on sort of, custom and anecdote and, whatever. So what Oliver did was he extracted data from all these, and he got a lot of partners, by the way. That's the other thing about New Orleans that I find fascinating, is they have leveraged partnerships far more effectively than I did in New York. In New York, I had a very New York attitude, which was I held the entire outside community, whether it was technological, civic-minded, academic, I held them in high dudgeon and wanted nothing to do with them, right? So I was forced to, politically on occasion, interact with those guys, but I really hated it. Because I was paranoid. I wanted to keep control over the product. I'm a product of my environment. And I come from the civil service, so I just brought that with me. Now, we could get away with that because we were in New York and I had resources, right? But what Oliver, in a city that is less, almost a 20th the size of New York City's budget is $70 billion a year, right? New Orleans is not that. So Oliver had to figure out a way, how do I get these insights generated, right? And so what he did was he basically hired a bunch of people to go out, just as much as they were data analysts, they went out and they were use case truffle pigs, right? So they just kind of went to every agency and was like, what's your problem? Why do you hate us? What can I do to help, right? And then they would scope problems and then farm those out to partners. Sometimes it's universities, so in the ambulance case that I'm about to describe, they farmed it out to universities. In another case, they farmed it out to the company I work at, right? The smoke detector thing, which got them started. And in yet another case, they started working with a civic hacking organization. So they outsourced all their work. What he realized, and what cities have to realize, is there's tons of value in your province as a city that somebody wants to do something with. So let me kind of close out here. I know I'm taking up more time than I should. But the ambulance product there is based on an analysis of the 911 calls. You now have a much better way, much more statistically rigorous way of figuring out where to park your ambulances based on date stamps and times of year and weather patterns, right? But the action taken is move the damn car, right? So turn the key, hit the gas, and move 4 blocks that way. That's easy. You're not asking the city to do anything more than it already does, right? That's a nice, easy deployment of the data on behalf of the citizenry that doesn't cause major culture change within the organization. So that's it. I'm sorry I took longer. I'm sorry I talk so fast.
You're not sorry you trash boroughs, are you?